Welcome to Mentoring in Real Life, where we talk about what it takes to find and be a great mentor. I'm Angela, and together with my co-host Bill, we know the power of mentoring and what it can do in your life on both sides of the table. If you're interested in learning tips, tricks, and hearing stories about mentoring, you're in the right place. Come join us. Hey, Bill. How you doing?
Never been this happy.
Never been this happy. Well, today we are here to talk about how to use coach-like skills in mentoring and the benefits of doing so. What do we mean when we're talking about coach-like skills? What we're saying is giving advice as a mentor is very easy to do. And the intent in using coach-like skills in mentoring is to actually encourage our mentees to identify their own path and come up with their own solutions. So the mentor's role is not to create the mentee's best career, but rather help and guide the mentee to create their own best career. So today's discussion is an extension of our discussion from episode 4, where we describe the difference between mentoring, coaching, and being an advocate.
Yeah,
Anything else you'd
so
like to add, Bill?
yeah, sure. I mean, obviously we talked about you don't want to try and create their career. They need to do it for themselves. That's an important piece that shouldn't be understated. We talked about mentees needing to take ownership of the relationship. Of course, they actually need to take ownership of the career they want to have. And so, number one, it needs to come from within, and we'll talk about that more today. But the other part is the last thing you want is the mentor has recommended some path that the mentee really didn't come up with for themselves. And if it doesn't work out, guess whose fault it is, right? I mean, there'll be an opportunity to say, see, the mentor told me the wrong stuff, as opposed to allowing the mentee to define where they're going to go and have the mentor provide them advice along the way, but based on the career path that the mentee has designed for themselves.
So, Bill, what do you see as the most fundamental coach-like skill set that mentors need to use?
Well, I appreciate you throwing me another softball. As always, I'm going to lean back and go to my favorite place, which is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
You mean where you're an unpaid ambassador?
I continue to be an unpaid ambassador. I may have to check with them over that. In any case, if I go back to habit 5, which is seek first to understand and then to be understood, it's listening to the mentee. And so particularly in the early parts of any mentoring conversation, you're listening and not talking much at all. In fact, the point being you're listening to understand their viewpoint. And you're certainly not listening so that you can judge what they said or even really reply to it. In the earliest part of the conversation, I just think the silence is such a powerful tool for the mentor because, as it turns out, in professional life, and as I found out very clearly in personal life, when somebody stops talking for a second, they're often just focusing their thoughts so they can say whatever the next sentence is. And when you jump in, you interrupt the flow and you presume that you know that you know the full context of their thought. And so the silence in that listening is a very powerful tool. I would suggest as a mentor, you get comfortable with long periods of uncomfortable silence to allow the mentee to get it off their chest, whatever is on their mind about where they want to go, what problems they see, what challenges they have. And so I just couldn't be more strongly advocating a lot of listening as you get started. The whole point is to understand how they are viewing the issues and challenges in their life. There's going to be plenty of time to share your viewpoints after you gain that understanding. And chances are your input's going to be much more meaningful because you took the time to understand the mentee. So at this point, the mentor just is not in a problem-solving mode. Even if you're sitting there thinking, I know where this person needs to go, don't give advice at this point. They don't need advice at this point. They need you to understand them. So they're going to be much more motivated in any case if they come up with their own path and their own solution because you let them go there, you listened, and you wait for the advice time after you understand their viewpoint.
Yeah, active listening is so important as a coach, certainly, and as a mentor. The idea that you, first of all, create a space for them to even speak about whatever is on their mind, but then also that you hear them and that they come up with a solution on their own. That means they have buy-in. That means they have the motivation to actually take steps towards whatever goal it is that they want to achieve. So active listening is the fundamental foundation for that to happen. So the mentor is a solid active listener. They've got that skill set down. What do you think is next?
Well, so they've got to figure out at some point when it seems like the mentee has given them the context and given their view of what's going on and where they'd like to go, you got to figure out how to ask the right kinds of questions. So powerful questions are not yes and no questions because that's a very short conversation. Do you like this idea? Yep. Okay, well, that didn't really tell me much. So it's got to shift from a conversation that gives yes or no to powerful questions that give you an opportunity to talk about things, gives the mentee an opportunity to talk about things. And so an example of those kinds of questions like, well, what's on your mind? And then when they finish, and what else? And tell me more about that. And, what does success look like for you? Those questions can't be answered with yes or no or short, pithy answers. You really got to get into it. And so that helps really bring out what's on their mind in a very, very different way than you providing advice and them saying yes or no, I like it.
Mm-hmm.
And so certainly one of our calls to action has to be that the prospective mentors have got to write down powerful questions that work for them. And I would recommend they use putting a pen on a piece of paper, not typing it, only because I think that makes it stick better in your brain by actually putting pen to paper. And so my dad told me a long time ago, the most important rule for doing a math problem is write it down. It's because it changes the way your brain thinks about it. And I think that applies here as well. Writing it down, those powerful questions, captures it in your brain a very different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're trying to shift the mentor from a mindset where they say, here's what I did, to what do you think would happen? What are you willing to try? What are you willing to do differently? And when that happens, then it gives the ownership back to the mentee. It does not require the mentee to follow the mentor's same path. And it really just creates a much more open conversation and gives the mentee an opportunity to really give some thought behind what's next, what is it that they want to pursue.
So the other part that maybe it's obvious, but I think it's worth saying explicitly, try to ask one question at a time. You ask 3 or 4 different questions because you're so excited about something, and now it becomes a very jumbled up kind of answer. Try and keep the focus as much as your brain might be going, 10 years ahead of the mentee. Ask one question at a time, listen to the answers one question at a time, and work through the whole set with the mentee in a very orderly fashion. I think it'll be a much more powerful conversation.
Yeah, we in the coaching world, we call it when you ask more than one question at a time, we call that stacking questions. And when you stack questions and you're asking multiple at a time, it's kind of overwhelming for the person who's trying to respond. Like, which one do I respond to first? And so by giving one question at a time, that's a huge pro tip on how to be more coach-like in a mentoring conversation. By allowing just for one question at a time and waiting and using that active listening skill that we talked about first for the response, it gives a lot of space in the conversation for the mentee to really gnash through whatever it is that's on their mind.
I think that actually, so I think you captured a really important part there, giving them the space and letting them fill the space as opposed to the mentor always feeling the need because they're the quote unquote smart person in the room. That's first off, not necessarily true. And second, this is about the mentee's career and letting them fill the space for what the answers to those questions are is critical to them being able to sort things out for themselves with the mentor's help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the mentee, or excuse me, the mentor leverages active listening and leverages powerful questions to gain some insight into what it is the mentee wants for their challenges they might have, what they might want to do for their career. That really opens up an opportunity for them to create goals. So, how does a mentor use goal creation in a coach-like way?
Well, when I think about coaching tools for helping mentees to set goals, I think about SMART goals. So, so that there are specifics related to it, something that you can measure, and then with a specific timeline set for what's going to happen. So as you're coaching your mentee, you don't want to just let them pick goals. You need to say things like, so by when would you like that to happen? And when are you willing to commit to get that done? And those are hard questions, because it's easy to pontificate about all the great things you want to do. You want me to commit to something? Yeah, that makes it a real and a big, big hurry. And as I said in the last cast about the importance of that, now you have an accountability date with your mentor, which I think is phenomenal. That's a great coaching skill that the mentors can use to say, so just very casually, when are you going to get that done? That changes the nature of the goal setting. It's not just an aspirational goal. It's something I'm going to go do. And so the beauty in this conversation is now you're having the mentee take the responsibility for setting and achieving their own goals. I used this any number of times with people I was mentoring, and it was incredibly powerful because they tell me the date by which something's going to happen. And all I do is say, okay, then that's the date it's going to be. And now they come to that conversation and say, oh, I don't want to disappoint the mentor, so I'm going to make sure I get things done by those dates. And that accountability is invaluable. There's going to be, the mentor can bring into this conversation now, hey, look, I know there are going to be some certain steps that you need to accomplish to get to where you're going. And so it's important for me to let the mentee know what those things are. But it's not for me to create the path. If I know there's some steps along the way, I can share that, and then they're going to set up the plan and set up the dates, and they're going to figure out how to do that. And so that's absolutely critical, because that changes it from me giving them an assignment to them buying in and saying, now that there's going to be some intrinsic motivation to meet those goals.
Okay, you brought up a term, intrinsic motivation. Let's define what that means. So intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic means that it arises from within the individual. So in what you're talking about, it's the mentee's internal motivation to get from point A to point B and establishing those goals to get there. Other examples of intrinsic motivation might be things like, I really want to read this book because I'm interested in it, not because I have to. Or I really want to play a specific sport because I really enjoy it. Or I create some sort of challenge or hobby that brings personal fulfillment. This is really important for finding your why, especially at the workplace. So when a person is intrinsically motivated, there's a lot of advantages to that. They've got sustained engagement. They're going to stick with the task, and they're going to stay engaged in the process and have personal satisfaction in actually being sustained in the process. Also, the individual tends to have a lot of deep learning when it comes to being intrinsically motivated, because they're not just going to check the box off, check it and forget it. They're actually going to be interested in getting deep into whatever it is that they are intrinsically motivated to do. They're also self-directed. So when you're extrinsically motivated, you might just be trying to get it done to avoid some sort of a punishment. But when you're intrinsically motivated, your curiosity really opens up doors, and you're more self-directed in learning what's next and how to solve whatever challenge that you have in front of you, how to achieve whatever goal you've set. In addition, there's increased persistence. So people are more likely to continue with the task just because it's rewarding to do the task when you're intrinsically motivated. So we talk about intrinsic motivation for goals, and when mentees create their own, then they are more intrinsically motivated. Sometimes, if you're only intrinsically motivated, you don't have an external accountability partner that a mentor provides, you can actually be slower to develop in that there's nothing kind of prodding you except for your own intrinsic motivation. And so, because there's nothing prodding you, you'll take your sweet time. So, this is where you talked about SMART goals and how a mentor can help define those with a mentee, making something that's time based, something that's measurable, something that's actionable, realistic, right? Making sure that there's a date associated with a particular goal helps the mentee who is intrinsically motivated to get it done have an external prod, being the mentor, to keep accountability to that. That's different than being extrinsically motivated. So, what we aren't advocating is that the mentor provide extrinsic motivation, because extrinsic motivation, just by definition, really means the motivation comes from outside of the individual. There might be external rewards or avoiding punishment that is the reason that extrinsic motivation happens. I think about chores with my kiddo, right?
Well, sure. And I mean, and certainly there are things in anybody's career that are extrinsically motivated. But when we're talking about mentoring somebody, we're not saying that there's never extrinsic motivation for things. But as a mentor, that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for motivation that comes from within, because it isn't attached to anybody outside. It's all the things that you get to control about where you're going to go as the mentee. And so I just want to make sure we're clear. Yeah, of course, there's extrinsic motivation for lots of things in the workplace. But as the mentor, that's not the stuff you're working on with this person. They got supervisors and directors and program managers and all sorts of things to help them with extrinsic motivation. You're helping them with the things that will motivate them from within, that will help them be very, very successful. Because certainly one of the principles that I shared with mentees many, many times over is you better be doing something that you love to do, because you're going to be doing a lot of it. And so if you're not enjoying the work that you're doing, I'd recommend you find something different to do. And I had that conversation with people over the career, because if they're not happy, typically their motivation is almost purely extrinsic. You know, they're being told to do stuff, and they spend a lot of time doing things, but not because they really want to. So I think for the mentor's viewpoint, they're trying to help the mentee find things that are motivating from within. And that's sort of critical to this whole conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if a person's working for the extrinsic motivation of getting that paycheck every 2 weeks, and that's the only thing that they're working towards, that's a much different conversation. That person's career and motivation for growing in their career is going to be vastly different than somebody who's intrinsically motivated to grow in their career for their own gain and to support the organization or the company that they're, or the industry that they're growing in. So we would advocate a call to action then for mentors. I'm curious to mentors, how many of you know specifically what your mentees have identified as their goals? Maybe you do. Maybe you've written them down. Maybe you're very clear on what their goals are, and you have a solid goal setting structure, something like a SMART goal structure or whatever goal structure works for you. If you don't know what your mentees' goals are, ask them and write it down so that every time you meet, you can keep them accountable. And we'll get into accountability in a few minutes, but specifically ask them so that they know you understand what their goals are, you know what their goals are, and you can help keep them moving towards those goals. I'm curious, Bill, that's for goal setting for mentors and mentees, and how a mentor can help a mentee make sure they maintain their goals. What happens when a mentee comes to a mentor with some example of something that's happened? And I'm curious about coach-like skills that can be leveraged in this kind of example. So let's say they they gave a really bad interview, they fumbled a briefing or a delivery of a milestone or some deliverable that they had, they fumbled it. They have a challenging employee that they have to have a hard conversation with. So, how does a mentor leverage feedback and reflection in a coach like way?
So I just have to tell you that you're giving me cold sweats because each one of those examples brought to mind something very specific from like some fumbled briefing.
Yeah, we've got examples in real life.
We sure do. Uh, and so certainly those people will get some sort of feedback typically from their supervisory chain and so forth. But in a coaching sense, the mentor should be in a place where where the mentee is sharing that. They should be providing some feedback and some reflection of what they heard. It's important for the mentor to be available to do that with them. And so they can provide it in a very different way than a supervisor would provide it or a project manager. They can be completely supportive, completely constructive, and say, so how are we going to learn from this without any of the strong emotional part that comes from, a work-like beating for, hey, you screwed that up. And so those are really important points between the mentor and mentee, because that stuff's going to happen. And so as the mentor, the first thing you're going to do is say, so what do you think about the experience? How did you feel about what went on? And so and I said those two things very specifically because it's important to talk about how they thought about it or how they're thinking about it, and also how they felt about it. Because the feeling is related to, sort of intuition and their sort of gut instincts, and thinking is the brain-based logic piece of it. And so it's important to acknowledge that there's a difference between those two things. Some other training from previous in my life, there was always, when you're looking at any event, there is what happened, and then there's your story about what happened. And those are often not the same thing. The internal conversation you're having with yourself about what happened, when actually you said one or two sentences, but in your brain, you thought that the world ended because of what you said. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to sort of separate those things. And so an easy example that comes to mind is, you're briefing an audience and you're making assumptions about how the audience is perceiving what happened. And I saw this at a Myers-Briggs briefing, does personality types and so forth. And this very energetic speaker was up on stage, and he's talking, he's all excited, and he's very animated. And he's looking at this person in the front row who's just absolutely just staring at them, stone-faced, just staring at them. And afterwards, he thinks he knows whether he was getting through the audience or not, and he wondered what was wrong with his brief. The person walks up to him at the end and says, "That was like the best brief I've ever heard. I can't believe how powerful that was." To which the speaker said, "Well, you should tell your face about it sometime," because he was assuming he knew what was going on in that person's brain. So it's a very, very clear definition of what actually happened and what the speaker thought was happening. So after understanding that a little bit better, now that you've figured all that part out, now go to the mentee and say, so did your words or whatever did they get the results you wanted? And if they didn't, what are the ways you could have handled that differently? And at that time, once you've done the coaching question part, you can also, if you think that they missed some points, that's a time when a mentor can say, so can I offer you some feedback that's going to sort of go beyond whatever they happen to think about it. And you can provide them details on specific behaviors or recommendations you might have for tackling some of the different challenges.
Yeah, you're bringing up, challenging assumptions is a specific coach-like skill, or coaching skill, I should say, that coaches use with their clients. And that's what we're talking about here too, especially when you're getting into what really happened versus what is the story about what happened. Because when we follow the story about what happened, and that's what our instincts, our behaviors change to accommodate, then we can really set up ourselves with some limiting beliefs, some assumptions about why we got the feedback that we got, either behaviorally, like you're talking about by this person who was on the stage and looking at the stone-faced person in the front row who turns out loved everything that he was saying, but didn't tell his face that.
Right. And it's the irony, of course, was it's a Myers-Briggs personality briefing that he was giving, and all he was doing was demonstrating that there are really animated people, and there are people who are very introverted who just think about things a long time, and then after a while, now they're ready to talk about it. Sorry, there's just irony in the way that it all occurred, and just demonstrates the importance of recognizing what happened and what your story is. And I think it's worth commenting as well. I don't think it's uncommon that people's story about what happened is often more negative than the events that actually transpired. Self-doubt gets in the way of things. And so it's important while you're mentoring people to sort out, okay, let's talk about what happened. You just told me how awful it went. So tell me about what actually happened, and then we'll talk about whether or not that was awful or not. And those are important distinctions to make that just keep coming around.
You know, you just reminded me, yeah, that is our instinct, is to assume the worst. And we do that, it's inherently part of us because our brains are wired, our amygdala is wired for survival. And because of that, we're always in, whether or not we recognize it, there's this like, are we being chased by the saber-toothed tiger? Are we being chased? Our survival instincts come in. And so it's very much a protection mode for us to respond in a way that makes an assumption that the person is essentially on the attack. That's often how our brains interpret it. And so because of that, our behavior often modifies because of that. And becoming aware is the first step in us like getting out from this survival mode and getting into growth and developing mode.
You bet.
So we talked about feedback and reflection. The mentor really can be an excellent avenue for the mentee to reflect on what has happened, what a challenge they've had, or what a challenge they're about to face, and how to learn from previous challenges and leverage those learnings for future challenges. A mentor can also offer feedback to a mentee. We also talked previously about this idea of goal setting and this idea of accountability. So the mentor starts with active listening and hearing what it is that's important to the mentee. The mentor leverages powerful questions that really brings the level of curiosity. The mentor helps with goal setting. And as the mentee is moving towards those goals, there are opportunities for feedback and reflection to the mentee. And now we get to accountability. How does the mentor provide accountability to the mentee?
Yeah, so this, I think, is where the mentoring and the coaching, again, overlaps in a significant way, because you can use that coaching mindset to help the mentee in follow through. What we're talking about really is intrinsic motivation with some external accountability. The mentor is that external accountability because it just is very valuable. The mentee says they want to do something, and the mentor just provides a much more gentle accountability than a supervisor or a manager kind of person to keep them honest and keep them moving towards their goals. There's no punishment involved. If they didn't make some goal, it's not like you're going to yell at them about it. You're going to say, how are you going to get that back on your calendar and make sure you get that done by the next time? And it's sort of the gentle guidance with a little bit of a velvet hammer behind it. It says, look, you came to me. I'm trying to help you meet these goals. How are you going to go do that? And, in any good relationship I've had with mentors, I would do anything to avoid disappointing my mentor. And I think that probably is true of most people. If they have that kind of relationship where they've asked for help, the last thing they want to do is disappoint the person who's tried to provide the help. And so the mentees don't want to do that. And it turns out, since it's the velvet hammer mode, I started to think about it like hearing from your mom or your dad, I'm so disappointed in you. There's no yelling, there's no, you're in big trouble, but what an awful experience when that happens. And the last thing,
worst.
And so we were talking about what happened, what story is being told. When I would have to say, oh, I didn't get that one done, the story in my mind was, oh, they're so disappointed in me. They didn't say it. I said it for them. And so It's encouraging the mentee to keep the promises that they're making to themselves. And so in doing that, I would say that the mentor's job then, as they're working through those goals and what accountability will look like, there's just fundamental questions. So what's the next action, and by when are you going to get that done? And not like I'm giving an order, I'm asking you so that we can set up accountability agreements between the two. And so it's good for the mentee, but I will tell you also it's quite good for the company that has the mentoring program installed. In our research, the companies that have studied the impact of mentoring inevitably finds an increase in productivity to employees when they have a mentor. The example companies that in the research are, small companies like Cisco, IBM, General Electric. I
The little
think,
teeny tiny ones.
yeah, the little ones, the small businesses. But I think it's not just a feeling. There's data that shows that this is the kind of stuff that works for the mentees and mentors, as well as for the company's productivity.
Yeah, it's so true. So we've talked about a number of coach-like skills and how leveraging these coach-like skills ensures that ownership of the mentee's career belongs with him or her. It opens up curiosity and develops problem-solving skills for the mentee rather than the mentor having the monkey on his or her back and being responsible for the mentee's outcomes. Instead, the mentee maintains positive control over their career and aspirations. What else would you like to add, Bill?
Well, so I think it's worth just a brief recap of what it means. The monkey on the back thing is a very serious discussion about coaching and mentoring, because there are people who are problem solvers who become mentors. And so the mentees might be tempted to come in and say, I have this problem. And mentors be tempted to say, okay, I can fix that for you. And so, in fact, I know I'm not a certified coach like the other person in this call, but I got some coaching training along the way. And a classic coaching cartoon has a line of people outside the manager's office, or in this case, the mentor's office, that have monkeys on their backs. And they all walk in and drop one off. And at the end, the last showing in the cartoon is the mentor has all the monkeys on their back, and then the mentee is walking out with a big smile on their face. That's not the way this works. And it's important for us to acknowledge as mentors, it is not your problem to solve the mentee's problem. It's your job to help them solve their problems and help them lay out a path. So I just didn't want to let that go by, because I think that's an incredibly important piece, because senior leaders typically have lots of answers and they've seen how to go about getting things done. And there might be some tendencies to do it themselves or to do it for the mentee. I would strongly recommend resisting that emotion.
You just mentioned that you're not a certified coach, but you've received some coach training along the way. And we in our organization, in the organization that Bill and I have since left and retired from, we believed in this concept so much that we, as part of the coaching program, actually developed a training program for leaders to learn coach-like skills and to practice those coach-like skills in real world conversations, in a laboratory training, classroom kind of environment, before they took it out to their teams, to their direct reports, and so on. So it's out there. The idea that you can learn coach-like skills as a leader is out there. It's not just training. There can be books. There can be a number of ways. I will say that what's important is to actually practice the coach-like skills, because this is just like you can't learn how to become a parent by reading What to Expect when you're expecting. It's not until you have to actually keep the little thing alive, the little bugger alive, that you learn what it means to actually take care of an infant. The same is true for leveraging coach-like skills in any kind of leadership, and especially mentoring kind of conversations.
It almost sounds like you're recommending that if somebody's going to send up a mentoring program, that would be a good additional piece of setting up that mentoring program.
I absolutely think so. Teaching leaders how to learn and leverage coach-like skills in a way that they can actually practice them has just proven to be an incredibly successful program in our previous organization. And I fundamentally believe that it would be impactful for any organization that takes that on.
I'm on your team.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode of Mentoring in Real Life. If you have thoughts or questions, feel free to leave us a comment or send us an email, which we've included in the show notes. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, rate the podcast, and share with a friend. Until next time, help others climb.